Hello, I'm delighted to join you today to explore the outcomes of the rescue and rehabilitation of wildlife during the so-called Black Summer bushfires in Australia. I would imagine that regardless of where you are based around the world, this event made the headlines. It spanned a period of approximately 6 months, from September 2019 through to February 2020, with a peak over the new year of unusually intense, severe and widespread bushfires in many parts of Australia. And the statistics are quite shocking. An estimated 17 million, perhaps more, hectares of land burnt. This is the largest area burnt in a single recorded fire season for Eastern Australia. 80% of the Australian adult population was affected either directly or indirectly. Tragically, 33 people died. Greater than 7,000 firefighters were deployed. Over 3,000 homes were destroyed. 80,000 people were displaced. 70 countries offered financial and/or practical assistance on top of countless private citizens. But arguably the most astonishing statistic is that an estimated 3 billion wild animals were affected, making this one of the worst wildlife disasters in modern history. The fires were the culmination of a period of nervous anticipation for the community. We were well and truly seated in our new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, an era in which human actions are affecting and influencing all life and all systems on our planet. 2019 was the driest year on record in Australia, with many parts of the country suffering an extended drought. The map of the country here indicates the rainfall deciles through much of 2019, with red coloration corresponding to below average rainfall, and the deep red areas, the lowest ever recorded. This is a land of creatures and habitats adapted to meteorological extremes, and yet there was a distinct sentiment that this was escalating rapidly into something very out of the ordinary. Meanwhile, in the field of psychology, discussions about the emergence of new conditions such as ecological grief and climate distress were being murmured. For many people, climate change was evolving from an abstract scientific concept into something directly affecting their well-being. So to provide some context, let's look at the pre-existing wildlife rescue and rehabilitation process as it stood at the onset of the fires. In Australia, wildlife rescue and rehabilitation is carried out almost exclusively by volunteers, numbering in the order of 20,000. The work undertaken is self-funded, and research has indicated that the numbers of rescued animals is increasing and that the cause of their troubles is overwhelmingly anthropogenic. Wildlife rehabilitators are supported by a network of veterinarians, some with specific postgraduate qualifications working exclusively with wildlife in purpose-built hospitals, and others in general practices. Much of this work is done pro bono. The principles of triage for rescued wildlife in any scenario, bushfire or otherwise, firstly consider the immediate and future welfare. Limited resources must be used wisely. Relevant factors that can influence decision making include the species status, legislation, human health and safety, and prognostic factors related to the specific injury, illness, or circumstance, including the identification of a suitable habitat for release. Surveys of veterinary personnel and wildlife rehabilitators across multiple states were conducted in the aftermath of the Black Summer to firstly document the most significant animal welfare issues encountered, and secondly to evaluate the most significant factors that influenced animal welfare adversely in this natural disaster response. The surveyed veterinary personnel were a mix of those who worked in a paid versus voluntary capacity in assessing and treating bushfire victims. All the wildlife rehabilitators surveyed were volunteers. There was a variable mix of experience in both groups, ranging from those who had not been involved with wildlife much before, through to those with decades of expertise. The vast majority of animals rescued alive and presented for treatment were koalas and, to a lesser extent, macropods, that is, kangaroos and wallabies, with a distinct large marsupial bias, even though the post-event data suggests that other species groups like birds, reptiles and amphibians were adversely affected in vastly larger numbers. The animal welfare concerns cited by the survey respondents were ranked, and here is a brief compilation of the most common. The bold text refers to primary issues raised by both veterinary personnel and rehabilitators, and the regular text to those that were key focus areas of one of these groups or the other. These included, first of all, not surprisingly, injuries and pain, including smoke inhalation, burns, capture-related myopathy, and fractures, and problems that developed whilst in care. Secondly, poor quality of care for some, including inadequate use of pain relief and anaesthesia for animals undergoing painful procedures. There were concerns about prolonged suffering and captivity with delays in euthanasia or release. Fear and distress and psychological suffering, starvation and dehydration, animals finding themselves in unsuitable environments, either in the wild or in captivity, and an inability to exhibit normal species-specific behaviours. Of note, collectively, these encompass all 5 of the established animal welfare domains. More than 45 potential contributing factors to the aforementioned animal welfare concerns were identified. Here I've listed the top 7, and the most frequently cited by both groups, again, are listed here in bold. A lack of knowledge, experience, skill and training, including lack of access to or ignorance of established wildlife care guidelines, was the top concern. This was either relevant to well-meaning members of public or inexperienced personnel. Secondly, habitat loss and displacement was a major concern, as well as the provision of inappropriate diet and housing. In some areas, there was a high case volume that stretched resources. A lack of leadership and poor communication, coordination and support concerned rehabilitators. There was difficulty accessing wild animals in the field safely, and veterinary advice was in some situations ignored or intentionally not sought due to fear of euthanasia. Some of the factors that contributed to positive outcomes included recruiting experienced wildlife vets and an open, honest approach to community transfer of information with strong community support for the work being done. Participants felt like they had a sense of purpose, and there were established clear and rational triage protocols for consistency, resourceful modification of non-specialist facilities for short-term housing, and quite rapid movement of animals through the process of rescue, triage, and either subsequent release or transfer to an appropriate longer-term holding facility. Personnel in these facilities felt like their primary role to relieve suffering was acknowledged and appreciated. And despite limited equipment and facilities, the staff and volunteers felt supported and were rotated sufficiently frequently to avoid burnout. So exploring the themes in light of the OneWelfare pillars, we clearly had an environment that had sustained landscape level damage with flora and fauna population and ecosystem changes. Natural resources were adversely impacted, air quality was poor, even in distant locations, and the heat oppressive. With respect to animal welfare, in addition to the fire-related harms, wild animals potentially suffered physical and psychological harms from capture, transport, examination, and temporary captivity, especially if the people involved were untrained. While some animals appeared to cope better than others, there has been little in the way of objective assessment of Australian wildlife welfare in rehabilitation settings, something that is just starting to be addressed. Only limited post-release monitoring was carried out, and so longer-term welfare of many victims is largely unknown. For the well-being of the humans, the work was challenging and yet rewarding. It was a stressful time for many citizens, and there was a deep sense of camaraderie. In any emotionally charged multi-agency response involving large numbers of passionate volunteers, interpersonal conflicts are unavoidable. Disappointingly, there were reports of serious bullying within and between groups of responders at some locations, with fragile egos and the temptation of self or group promotion impairing cooperation. There were a number of cross-element issues too that impacted on 2 or all 3 of the OneWelfare pillars. Ethical conflicts were encountered with strong differences of opinion in how animals should be treated or supported. In equivocal situations, in hindsight, there was recognition that some animals were treated in order to keep the group's morale going, rather than a decision made strictly on welfare grounds. Public praise for apparent demonstrations of heroic selflessness and compassion was intense. The global media and social media attention appeared to play a role, and some regrettable publicity situations clearly showed a lack of consideration for animal welfare. Examples include delaying urgent medical care for photo opportunities, and some recovered animals being withheld from release for organised publicity. The unfamiliar and sudden influx of funding to a sector that had previously struggled to generate much public financial support meant that much needed cash was available for veterinary interventions and desperately needed upgrades to facilities, but there was an unrealistic expectation that the increased funding would equate to the ability to save everything, regardless of prognosis. Media attention and emotional attachments exacerbated this and may have, in some cases, clouded judgment. There was a desperate hunger for a good news story. In reality, euthanasia of many victims was appropriate, but rarely reported and strained relationships. There have been some really exciting developments in preparing our next time strategy. These include the planning of wildlife response teams, a trial of a televet service to provide remote expert veterinary advice to general practice vets or rehabilitators isolated by disaster, research grants awarded to investigate prognostic factors for fire-affected wildlife, the rollout of training programs for vets, vet nurses and wildlife carers, and revisions of the codes of practice and guidelines, and there is still much to do. So in conclusion, the Black Summer fires demonstrated the inextricable connectedness of community, the environment and wildlife welfare. The collective sense of ecological grief and climate distress reverberated around the world and, as demonstrated, can impact disaster response. Unintended animal welfare harms can result from well-meaning actions to rescue and rehabilitate wild animals, and future natural disaster preparedness plans would benefit from taking a OneWelfare approach. I'd like to acknowledge Taronga Conservation Society for supporting this work and providing many of the images used in this presentation, the Australian Veterinary Association and Vets Beyond Borders for providing the platforms to begin these important discussions. And I take my hat off to everyone that selflessly raised their hand to help in whatever capacity was most needed during the fires and who retained their sense of integrity and professional judgment in what was such an overwhelmingly stressful time. I'm particularly grateful to those who have openly shared their experiences in order for us to move forward. Thank you so much for your attention, and I welcome any comments, questions or thoughts you may have.